tax inspection and litigation. Tax section of CFO 100. In this lecture, you can learn the process of tax inspection and litigation. And also you can learn how to mitigate the risk of tax correction. In the first slide, you can learn there are a typical process of tax inspection. You need to understand the entire view and the process of tax inspection as CFO. This understanding is more important than the tax filing process. The reason is that each country has a particular process of tax inspection, and rather than normal compliance with tax filing, it has irregular impacts on the PL and cash flow of the company. And then sometimes the size of the impact is very huge and it requires management decisions. So for the decision making as CFO, you need to understand the details of the process. If you look at the picture as a form of the flow chart, the first step is the preparation of the tax inspection. The preparation means compiling the documents before the tax inspector is coming. What is the first thing when tax inspector does? It is a request for documents and data. Based on the request from tax inspector, the company needs to submit the documents and information. This is the second step. However, the important point is that company should not disclose more things than what the inspector requires. This tip is the most important point to be taken care of. The amount of workload is very huge for this part of the process. The tax team needed to have additional workforce more than normal. In the third step, the inspector may have a discussion and hear the opinion about the particular items in which they have an interest. And if their concerns have not been cleared, that item will be on the potential list of correction. So, as a company side, you need to make efforts to convince the tax inspector of the background of the transaction and the correctness of the filing. In the fourth step, the tax inspector lists some of the potential items which will be corrected. In most countries, once the tax inspector lists the item, it will be retained in the final correction list. The tax department needs to inform CFO of the listed items. By doing so, CFO and the related divisions can understand the potential impact of tax correction. In the last stage, unfortunately, several items are on the final list. For the final correction, the tax inspector formally inform and issue the report to the company. If the company has any objection to it, there are further steps to go to tax court. The impact of tax correction has a direct influence on PL and cash flow of the company when the correction is determined. So, the tax inspection team needs to have good communication with the accounting team and CFO. In the next slide, you can learn what happens in next after tax inspection. It is a tax litigation process. In this slide, you can have a clear view of tax litigation process. You need to understand what are the particular steps and the process in the rule for your country, because each country has a different litigation process. As a CFO, you need to understand the core point which has an impact on decision making. Once there is the consequence of the tax litigation, it means that there is some impact on accounting and tax treatment. This picture shows a typical process of litigation. So the detail of the process may be different from your country's one, but the basic structure is the same even in different countries. Generally speaking, after tax inspection, you can go to tax court. Most of the country has a tax court to assess and give verdict for the tax correction. Normally, to proceed the process, you need to hire an advisor as a professional to fight against the tax inspector in court. The minor but important thing is that you have to understand how long it takes time for each process. It means that you need to understand when the loser of the court has to appeal to the next court level, and you need to know how long does it take from the beginning of the court process to the end. In developing countries, the first tax court is a local decision-making body, and it's not so much sophisticated and connected to the tax inspector behind. Such kind of nature is also important information to have your own view of the verdict. The High Court relatively has a fair opinion for companies, and in the last step of the court process, there is a Supreme Court as a final decision-making body. The role of the Supreme Court has some characters country by country. You need to understand what is the role of the Supreme Court in your country. Sometimes it is just a checking process body, not considering the content of the litigation. From an accounting perspective, the decision-making of the final court is very important because you cannot avoid treating the accounting perspective. After all, there is no change from this verdict in the future. The company should recognize the necessary loss based on that verdict. Even if you understand the court process of the country, there is a discrepancy of details in different countries. This is the point that you need to understand clearly about your country's tax litigation process where you have the business. Without this understanding, CFO cannot integrate the accounting and tax team to make necessary treatment for the tax issue. After learning the litigation process on top of the inspection process, you may be interested in how to mitigate the risk of tax correction. On the next page, you can see the overview of those points. In addition to the basic understanding of the tax inspection process and the litigation process, there are several items that you need to understand. Those are topics related to mitigating the risk and controlling the loss caused by tax correction. Firstly, in terms of tax inspection and litigation, there is a particular point about the prescription. Prescription means from time onward, tax inspectors cannot open past cases even though they would like to point them out. The period depends on the country by country. For example, in the UK it is 4 years, in Japan it is 5 years, in India it is 4 years. The next point is tax deposit and interest for unpaid tax. To reduce interest payment and penalty payment, a company can deposit the money before the definitive verdict in tax court. Not all countries has this type of system, but it is important to understand how you can mitigate the unnecessary risk for the pointed item by depositing money in the government. And also, interest on the tax payment is not a small topic because the interest rate is relatively high for unpaid tax. So, you need to understand what is the interest rate in your country and whether or not there is a rule for max charged interest. For example, in the UK, the interest rate is based on the Bank of England rate. In Japan, it is 14.6% per year. It is 1% per month in India. Like these, you can see the different interest rate rules. At the bottom of this page, you can see a mitigation way for tax risk. There are several typical ways to mitigate tax and inspection risks. Advisors' opinions, APA, MAP, and tax regime change are the main topic in this field. And the important point is that it is better to be considered before inspection because there are several ways to be utilized in the process of inspection and it is not so effective in the court process. Advisor's opinion is one such type of item. The MLP's effectiveness depends on each country, so it is not a definitive solution for every country. Monitoring tax regime change and detecting the possibility of critical change is a key routine activity which the tax department should take care of and inform the CFO. By the combination of those mitigation ways, CFO can reduce the tax risk, but the most proper way is doing the correct tax filing. At the end of this lecture, you remember why it is important for CFO to understand the tax inspection and litigation process. Those activities are an irregular item apart from normal tax filing, and there are some decision-making points as CFO. To have a clear view and decision-making mind, without an understanding of your country's tax process, CFO overlooks important decision-making points and the time to recognize the related laws. The rule is complicated and localized, so it is necessary to have a clear view of the inspection and litigation process to become a good CFO.